Hello and welcome to our Week 15 head coach rankings. I'm Ian O'Connor from EdjSports here with our EdjSports co-founder Frank Frigo and Aaron Schatz, Football Outsiders editor-in-chief. Before we get into our rankings this weekend and some of the action from this past weekend, we want to give a little bit of a refresh on our methodology. There was a little bit of confusion last week, and just to update everyone, in case you forgot or if you're new here to our coach rankings videos. So Frank, why don't you refresh us a little bit on what goes into these coach rankings?
Sure. So there's two key components, the CCI, or the critical call index, which is our examination of fourth down decision making. The reason why this is so important is we assess these decisions pre-snap solely based on the choice that the coach makes. So if we feel like something is done suboptimally that costs win probability, it is directly attributable to the coach. And we know that these decisions matter a considerable amount over the course of a season. An average NFL coach is going to give up something to the tune of 3/4 of a game on just these types of choices, sometimes as much as a game and a half we've seen in the past. So that's a very important component. The second one, which is more holistically, is the Edge Power Index, which incorporates the Football Outsider metrics and looks at team performance and execution in the context of the game. So between those two and averaging those out, we get a really good picture of who these coaches are and how they're affecting their team performance and their expected wins throughout the season.
Yeah, and now that we've got that little refresh, we've got a little bit more shuffling this week among the top three, just like last week, but all of our top five have remained the same. So the top three coaches, in third is Matt LaFleur, who drops down from second, but he's still in that top three. We've got Frank Reich, who drops from number 1 to number 2, and Andy Reid, who leapfrogs from number 3 back up to number 1. And he actually had the second best fourth down decision of Week 14. Aaron, why don't you tell us about that one?
Sure. It was fourth quarter. Kansas City was up 30-24, 4th and 1 on the Miami 40 with 2 minutes and 31 seconds left. Now, he could have tried a 58-yard field goal with Harrison Butker, but you're not going to hit a 58-yard field goal all the time. Your chances of converting that 4th and 1 are probably better than your chances of hitting the 58-yard field goal. If you miss that field goal, you give the ball back to Miami in excellent field position. So they went for it. They got it. And what's important is they got it with a short cross to Tyreek Hill that Hill then took for 22 yards. And that shows one of the things about going for it on fourth down is that it's not just a binary choice where you either get a yard or you don't get a yard. There's the chance that you're going to get a big gain. And that 22-yard gain put them in position to then run the clock down, kick a field goal that was a much easier field goal than the 58-yarder, which gave them a 9-point lead, which basically ended the game.
Yep, and a lot of the pushback we get too sometimes on those fourth and shorts is, the short run game has been terrible. The offensive line hasn't done a very good job in run blocking today or this season, whatever it is. And like you said, to a different point, that just goes to show you don't have to run the ball on 4th and 1. Mahomes had thrown with 3 interceptions in that game. They put the ball in his hands. He's the best player. A lot of times that's what we say is just give your best players a chance to get it. Doesn't have to be a run. You can pass the ball and convert that. And as you said, the Chiefs went on to win that game, sit at 12-1 now. So now we're going to look at a coach who's actually thought of being very aggressive, but has really taken a step back this season, kind of the opposite of what we've seen with Andy Reid the last few years. As we've mentioned, he's become very aggressive. He wasn't really before. But that one is Sean Payton, who's dead last in CCI this season and has been for a few weeks now. And he actually had the best and the worst decision of Week 14. What was that best decision, Aaron?
The best decision came in the fourth quarter, 9:57 left, 4th and 2 at the Philadelphia 42. He was losing 17-14. Now, some coaches are going to punt in that situation and, quote unquote, trust their defense. But Payton knew that it was better to go for it, and he did. Unfortunately, they failed because Taysom Hill got sacked and fumbled the ball. But it was the right decision. We make our decisions here. We make our judgments based on what the win probability change is, whether they get the fourth down or not. So the fact that they failed doesn't mean it wasn't a good decision. It was the right decision. It just didn't work out.
And like you said, a lot of coaches will trust their defense. And one thing that I always think of when it comes to that is the fact, if you really trust your defense, then you should be willing to risk it and go for it and give your opponent a little bit better field position than a punt if you really trust that your defense is going to get a stop there, which the Saints have been very good all year. They did struggle a little bit in that one, but that's something we hear a lot. And like I said, he also had the worst decision of the season in the second quarter of the week. I'm sorry, of week 14 in the second quarter. What happened in the second quarter there, Frank?
Yeah, so Sean Payton continues to be this enigma. He's got a very good team, but just seems to be misguided on some of these key critical call decisions. So this was a classic example of it. It's late in the first half. They've got a 4th and 1 on their own 48-yard line. About 2 minutes, 24 seconds left in the game. They're trailing 10-0 to the Eagles. This is a clear go. We've seen this time and again for a lot of the reasons that Aaron just mentioned. What do they do here? They decide to punt the ball away, and it's just a perfect amount of time for the Eagles to execute a drive, which, of course, we didn't know what the Eagles were going to do afterwards. They ended up scoring a touchdown, going up 17-0, but just based on what we knew at the point of decision, this is a costly one. So this is Payton solidifying his spot at the bottom of the CCI rankings.
And it's really confusing because, like you said, Payton, in his first years as a coach, all the way until about 2 years ago, was maybe the most aggressive coach in the NFL. Over the last 30 to 35 years, he's one of the top 8 or 9 most aggressive coaches on 4th down. So what's happened to him over the last 2 years is just shocking.
Yeah, and in this situation, he gives up about 6% winning chance, right? And when we talk about why these decisions are so costly, if this happens one time a game, if you give up 6% in a regular season of 16 games, you're giving up the equivalent of an expected game. I mean, this is really meaningful stuff, and he misses it here.
I mean, he gained 10.5% game-winning chance on the decision that I talked about, which was the 4th and 1 in the fourth quarter, but he's had very few of those this year and a lot more of those where he gives up a lot of game-winning chance.
And like you said, Frank, that 6 a game, which is something we've seen him do a lot this year, equates to about a game, and that's the difference between them being the 1 seed in the NFC right now ahead of Green Bay's got them on the tiebreaker. So that's at the end of the season, that can mean a huge deal, just one game. And Sean Payton is still number 18 overall. He's I think top 3 in EPI. So if he was even average, mediocre in that 16, 17 range in CCI, he'd be much higher overall. Now we're going to move on to something a little bit of something we saw last week. We saw a lot of disagreement last week on our rankings, especially up in New York, between Joe Judge of the New York Giants and Adam Gase of the Jets. So last week, Judge dropped 3 spots to 30th after beating Seattle. The main reason was that he dropped 6 spots in CCI. He did not have a very good game when it comes to 4th down decision making, as he's done most of the year. And Adam Gase moved up 2 spots to 18th. He went up 2 spots in CCI, but remains number 32 in EPI. So that's something a lot of people were very upset with, that Adam Gase is not dead last in the league in terms of the coach rankings. Why don't you guys tell us a little bit what goes into that, why Gase is a little bit higher, and then what happened with those two this week?
I'll say this is where it's really important to talk about the things that we are not including in our coach rankings. Let's be really honest here about what we don't include. First of all, this does not relate to performance based on expectation. We are using the EPIs to measure the performance of these teams. The Giants are not a good team. They may be in the hunt because they're in the NFC East, but they're 26th in Football Outsiders DVOA. The Jets, of course, are even worse. They're the worst team in the league. There's no question about that. They're 32nd in the EPIs. So that's, everybody agrees with that. But we're not looking at how the Giants are doing compared to the preseason expectation. This is just about how good they are in total. The other thing is we're looking half at in-game decision-making, which is, solely based on the coach, and half on the EPI, which is how good the team is overall. We're not looking at more subjective things like locker room management and, more subjective play call, scheming. Are you scheming your opponent correctly? Are your players trying hard, or are your players giving up? I mean, those things will be reflected in the EPI. And again, the Jets are in last place, but it's not like we're taking extra points away from Adam Gase because he annoyed Jamal Adams so much that Jamal Adams had to ask for a trade. That's not one of the things that we're measuring here.
Yeah. And, if we could rate the Jets lower than 32nd, we would. That just happens to be the floor. So we can't get any worse than that, despite how hard they try. But, as a 4th down decision maker, he's kind of operating in a bit of a neutral mode. I mean, here recently, they didn't really have opportunities to do too many things that were actually costly. I mean, when you're in a game that's very lopsided, it's hard to give up a lot of GWC win probability when you just don't have a lot riding in the balance. So, as Aaron said, I mean, there's obviously a much bigger picture to think about, but Gaze is a fourth down decision maker, has been reasonably solid in our view.
Yep, and Judge this week dropped one spot overall to 31st, down one in both CCI and EPI. Gase dropped 4 spots overall this week to 22nd. He dropped 3 spots in CCI, and like you said, can't go any lower than 32nd in EPI, no matter how much we think they deserve to. So now we're going to move on to something a little bit more positive. The biggest movers after week 14. So one thing to keep in mind is that the movement for a coach is not just based on how a team does that week. A team could have an average week, a bad week, and the coaches around them could be worse and move down, and they can move up. So that's something to keep in mind when we look at these coaches, because the first one is Matt Nagy. Example of movement mostly attributed to other coaches falling in this situation. Frank, why don't you tell us a little bit about Nagy this week and his overall spot in the rankings?
Well, he moves up 7 spots to 19th. He was up 2 in the CCI and up 4 in the EPI. And I think, Miami and Minnesota and the Jets moving down a little bit helped him move up. Obviously, the Bears had a nice victory this week. But, as you said, Ian, I mean, there is just a natural progression, a natural sort of crystallizing of our ratings. I mean, the reason that we come out each week, we don't pick our coach of the year in week 12 or 13 or 14. We pick our coach of the year after week 16. So we are going to see some shuffling and some natural movement as coaches kind of have opportunities to do things well and to make mistakes. And I think we'll get them, we get a clearer picture each week.
Yep. And then another coach that moved up is Doug Peterson, who had a great game in Jalen Hurts' first start, which was the Peterson we knew back in 2017. How did he do as far as moving in the rankings there, Aaron?
Yeah, Peterson was outstanding this week. He moves up 5 spots to 16th in the coach rankings. He's up 3 spots in CCI and up 3 spots in EPI. Had 4 fourth down goes for a cumulative pre-snap GWC increase of 7.6% and no fourth down errors in the entire game or extra point, 2-point conversion errors. So it was an excellent game for Peterson. Obviously, the Eagles looked a lot better. It was their best game of the season by DVOA. So he goes up in the coach ranking significantly.
Yep. So we'll see how those guys do moving forward, see if they're able to continue moving up and what happens in the rest of their games. But that does it for our coach rankings for week 15, heading into week 15, at least after week 14. We're getting closer to these final rankings, and we're starting to see these come into the final form, like you guys both mentioned. Our EdjSports Coach of the Year will be crowned after week 16. So these next 2 weeks, we could see especially that top 5 continue to jockey for the top spot. We've seen a little bit of shuffling each week. Those top 3 have remained the same, but have just switched spots a few times. Sean McDermott of Buffalo moved up in the top 5 last week. He remains number 5, while John Harbaugh remains at number 4. So tune in next week to see how these rankings update, and you can view them at edjsports.com.